Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about the steps of the scientific method. The scientific method is basically a series of steps that scientists would follow for them to go ahead and test out an educated guess they have about an observation. That educated guess, we refer to it as the hypothesis. And really, it's not just scientists that follow those steps. Everyone in their everyday lives actually follow the scientific method steps whenever they have a question in mind and whenever they want to test their prediction. So we follow the scientific method, and to kind of show you the steps of the scientific method and how we could actually use it and how we actually do use it in our everyday lives, let's go ahead and take a look at this simple example right here. So let's talk first about the steps of the scientific method. So the first step is for you to have an observation, and then based on that observation, you're going to be curious and you would ask a question. You would come up with a hypothesis, which is basically an educated guess, or in other terms, your hypothesis is basically you're trying to explain or come up with an answer that would basically answer your question. You would predict the results, and then to test your hypothesis, you will need to design an experiment. You will start collecting your data. Based on the data that you collect, you are going to figure out whether the data is supporting your hypothesis or whether it's refuting your hypothesis. If it is supporting your hypothesis, great, that means your hypothesis was correct. If it doesn't support your hypothesis, then that's fine. All you got to do is come up with a new hypothesis and go ahead and design another experiment and start collecting new data. So let's say that in this example, your observation is you notice that your remote is not working. So you're going to question, well, what's wrong with my remote? You're going to come up with a hypothesis, and as I said, you're trying to answer your own question. So maybe your answer is going to go something like this. My batteries are probably dead. That's why my remote is not working. Now, your hypothesis, for it to be a good hypothesis, it needs to be testable. So you have to have the means of testing out your own hypothesis. Otherwise, it's not going to be considered a good hypothesis. And a hypothesis could be correct or could be incorrect. So your prediction is, well, if I replace my batteries, my remote is going to work. Now, for you to test that hypothesis and your prediction, you have to design an experiment. In this example, your experiment is pretty simple. All you're going to do is go ahead and put in new batteries. So you're going to put in the new batteries, and then you're going to try your remote to see if it works. Now, if it does work, if it does support your hypothesis and your prediction, then that's great. If it doesn't, as I said, that's absolutely okay because hypothesis could be incorrect. Then you're just going to revise your hypothesis. You're going to have to think of something else other than the batteries. So what else could it be other than the batteries that's causing your remote not to work? So you will think of something else and you will go ahead and try to design a new experiment to see whether your hypothesis is supported or not. So basically, those are the steps of the scientific method. And as you can see, we really kind of use the scientific method every day in our lives. It's just that we don't really call it the scientific method when we are, for example, trying to figure out why our remote is not working. But that's the scientific method, and that's what scientists use in their labs whenever they want to design an experiment They sit down, they kind of think of a good hypothesis, and as I said, the hypothesis uh, needs to be testable. They can't come up with something that no way they can test it out. Hypothesis as well cannot be opinions, so you cannot test your own opinion because you're definitely going to be biased. So you can't say, I believe, like, or my prediction is that, Oreos are the best cookies ever, because that's going to be an opinion and you're not going to be able to test it out. Now, when you're designing an experiment, you have to have two groups. One group is going to be known as your control group. The other one is going to be known as your experimental group. What's the difference between the two? The control group is going to be the group that does not get the treatment that you are thinking or you're questioning. The experimental group is the one that's going to get the treatment. So let's say that my question is, I wonder if fertilizer is going to improve the plant's growth rate. So for me to test my own hypothesis, I have to start, designing an experiment to test whether the fertilizer is going to improve my plant's growth rate. So I'm going to get two plants. One plant is going to be my control plant, and that plant is not going to get the fertilizer. It's not going to get the treatment. And in this example, the treatment is the fertilizer. The experimental group is going to be my other plant, and that other plant, I am going to add to it the treatment, which is, as I said, the fertilizer. Whenever you're designing an experiment, you have to control as many variables as possible, and you only want to have one experimental variable. In this example, our experimental variable, the one thing that I really want to have different between those two plants is the fertilizer. So that's what I want to have. That's what I want to, have different, is the amount of fertilizer that I'm going to be adding to one of my plants. Everything else I want to control, meaning that both plants should be the same species of plants. Both plants should be watered at the same time. They should get the same amount of water. Both plants should be kept at the same temperature. And the reason why you want to control as many of the variables as possible, so that when you go ahead and you compare your results that you are going to be collecting from the control and from the experimental, you don't want to say that the reason behind the difference that you're seeing in your data is not just because one plant got the fertilizer and the other one didn't. You don't want to say, well, it's also because this plant was kept at room temperature and the other plant was kept at cold temperature. So the temperature has something to do with the difference that you're seeing. And so therefore, we want to control all of these other variables and only keep one variable that's different, and in this case it would be the fertilizer. Why have a control group in the first place, by the way, since this is the one not getting the treatment? Because you always want to have a group that you're going to be able to compare the data against your experimental group data. Otherwise, how could you really tell whether the treatment is working or not if you have nothing to compare it against? We also have what's known as an independent variable and the dependent variable. The independent is really the reason why we call it independent, because it's not really dependent on the experiment. It's basically what the experimenter chooses. It's basically the treatment that you choose. So in this case, I am choosing how much fertilizer, for example, I am adding to my experimental plant. The dependent variable is basically the variable that's dependent on the experiment. So you have to run the experiment for you to get the dependent variable data points. So let's say, for example, in this case, my dependent variable, I'm going to be measuring the height of my plant to figure out how much they're growing. So the dependent variable is basically what you're going to be measuring when you are running the experiment. Um, Independent variable, as I said, it's just what you chose, right, to add. So in this case, I chose to add the fertilizer, and I chose that I'm going to add, like, to, like, milligrams, or or you can add like more of the fertilizer or less. It's again up to you what you decide. Now, when it comes to talking about theories, a theory is something that's much broader in scope compared to a hypothesis. A theory is something that's more comprehensive, and it's a more comprehensive explanation, and it has to be supported by an abundant amount of data and evidence before we start calling it a theory. So let's say that one hypothesis that you come up with is that bears that are living in the Arctic habitat, their white fur is actually an adaptation that would help them survive in such an environment. Another hypothesis someone might have is that the bone structure in the hummingbird's wings is an adaptation, allowing them and giving them an advantage to gather actually the food, like the nectar from the flowers. Now, what's common about those two hypotheses is that you can kind of see that they're both trying to test, and they're both trying to prove that organisms that have the better qualities, or they have some sort of a quality that would help them and give them an advantage to be living in this environment, they will actually survive and do much better. And so if you know Charles Darwin, you know that Charles Darwin came up with what's known as the natural selection theory. Now, the natural selection theory did not start out as a theory, it just started out as a hypothesis. And then it turned into a theory because it was supported by tons of evidence. And so the natural selection theory, what it says is basically survival of the fittest. So those who are more fit to be living in a certain environment, they are the ones that are going to survive, and they are the ones that are going to reproduce more. And when I say fit, I don't mean, the organism is fit, like they go to the gym fit-wise. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is they have characteristics that's giving them an advantage for them to live in this environment. So for example, polar bears, the advantage that they have is the white fur color. So for example, if you bring California grizzly bears and you bring them over to the Arctic habitat, one thing is that their brown fur is going to stand out, in such a, snowy white habitat. And so what's so bad about them standing out? Like, the predators are going to be able to view them faster, and therefore they are going to be hunted more compared to the polar bears. So in this scenario, the polar bears have an advantage over the grizzly bears, and so therefore the polar bears will be the ones that are more fit to be living there, and therefore they will survive, and therefore they will reproduce more. And so for a theory, again, for it to be accepted and for it to become a theory, it has to be supported by an extensive amount of data, and all the data has to be, you shouldn't have any contradicting data. So if there's contradicting data, then we cannot call it a theory. I know that in our everyday language, we actually use theory instead of the word hypothesis. So we use theory as um, basically as our guess, right? So instead of saying like I guess, you say I like, you know, my theory is this is what's happening. So in the scientific world, though, theory and hypothesis are two majorly different terms. So as I said, a hypothesis is something like, you know, pretty big, and we don't have a whole lot of theories out there in science because, as you can see, it's kind of hard to come up with theories because it would have to be tested a whole lot, and all of your data has to support it, and you cannot have any contradicting data.